My name is Sarah, and I've been a senior nurse in the neurology wing of St. Augustine Medical Center for 15 years. In that time, I've seen doctors come and go, witnessed miracles and tragedies, and learned to read the subtle signs that separate the healers from the predators. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for what I discovered about Dr. Marcus Thorne, the man they called the god of the seventh floor. This is the story of how a whispered confession in a break room led to the most methodical takedown I've ever orchestrated, and why sometimes the only way to get justice is to collect it drop by drop. Literally. Let me paint you a picture of Dr. Marcus Thorne first, because understanding his reputation is crucial to understanding why what we did was so dangerous and so necessary. Thorne wasn't just any neurologist. He was the neurologist. The kind of doctor who had his own parking space with his name engraved on a brass plaque. The kind who brought in $7 million in research grants annually. Medical journals fought over his publications. Pharmaceutical companies sent representatives just to shake his hand. Patients flew in from other states specifically to be under his care. The hospital administration didn't just respect him. They worshipped him like he was their personal cash cow wrapped in a white coat. I'd worked alongside Thorne for 8 years, and I'll admit, initially, I was impressed. The man was brilliant. Genuinely, frighteningly brilliant. He could diagnose rare neurological conditions that other doctors missed entirely. His research on Alzheimer's progression was groundbreaking. He spoke at conferences worldwide and had that rare combination of medical genius and charismatic personality. Nurses from other floors would find excuses to visit our wing just to catch a glimpse of him during his rounds. He was tall, silver-haired, with those piercing blue eyes that seemed to see straight through you. When he spoke, even seasoned doctors listened like medical students. But here's the thing about being a nurse for 15 years. You develop instincts that go beyond medical training. You learn to read the spaces between words, the pauses that last a heartbeat too long, the smiles that don't quite reach the eyes. And over the past year, something about Thorne's research patients had been bothering me. Something I couldn't quite put my finger on, but it gnawed at me during long night shifts when the hospital was quiet, and your mind starts connecting dots you didn't even know were there. Thorne was conducting a longitudinal study on Alzheimer's patients, tracking the progression of cognitive decline over 18 months. It was legitimate research, approved by the ethics board, funded by a major pharmaceutical company. On paper, everything looked perfect. But his patients, God, his patients were different. They were calm. Not just calm. They were docile in a way that didn't match their diagnoses. Alzheimer's patients, especially in the moderate to severe stages, are typically agitated, confused, sometimes aggressive. It's heartbreaking, but predictable. These patients cycle through periods of lucidity and complete disorientation. They have good days and bad days. Moments of clarity followed by hours of fear and confusion. But Thorne's research subjects? They were consistently placid, almost unnaturally so. During his study sessions, they sat quietly, staring blankly ahead while he conducted his cognitive assessments. They didn't fight the blood draws. They didn't resist when he positioned them for brain scans. They were compliant, and compliance isn't typical for advanced dementia patients. I'd mention this to other nurses, but they'd just shrug and say how lucky Dr. Thorne was to have such cooperative subjects. Makes the research easier, they'd say. But easier isn't always better, and convenient isn't always ethical. I started paying closer attention to Thorne's research protocols. I'd review the medication charts of his study participants, looking for anything that might explain their unusual docility. Anti-anxiety medications were noted, but nothing in doses that would account for their zombie-like compliance. Sleep medications were documented, but again, nothing that would create this level of consistent sedation during daytime hours. Pain medications were minimal. Most Alzheimer's patients don't receive heavy pain management unless they have concurrent conditions. The more I looked, the more the pieces didn't fit. Then there were Thorne's scheduling patterns. Official research sessions were documented and followed proper protocols. But I began noticing he'd appear on our floor at odd hours. Late evenings, early mornings, sometimes during shift changes when the nursing staff was distracted with handoff reports. He'd claim he was just checking on patients, but these visits weren't logged in the official charts. No documentation, no nursing notes, no record that he'd been there at all. In a hospital where every aspirin is documented in triplicate, undocumented visits from any doctor should raise red flags. But when you're the golden boy bringing in millions of dollars, people tend to look the other way. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was just being thorough. Maybe he was the kind of dedicated researcher who checked on his subjects beyond the required schedule. Maybe I was being paranoid, seeing shadows where there was just dedication. After all, what did I know about cutting-edge neurological research? I was just a nurse, right? That's what I told myself for months. That's what I almost kept telling myself until the night Chloe came to me with trembling hands and a story that made my blood run cold. Chloe Martinez had been working in our neurology wing for 2 years. She was one of those bright, eager nurses who still believed that medicine was a noble calling, and that all doctors took their Hippocratic oath seriously. She was 26, fresh out of a prestigious nursing program, and she idolized Dr. Thorne, the way some people idolize movie stars. She'd volunteered to work extra shifts just to observe his research methods. She'd even asked him for recommendations for graduate school, because she dreamed of becoming a nurse practitioner specializing in neurology. Thorne had been her mentor, her inspiration, her professional role model. It was a Thursday night in October, around 11:30 p.m. I was finishing up my shift notes when Chloe appeared in the break room doorway. One look at her face told me something was catastrophically wrong. She was pale. Not just tired, pale but shock pale, like someone who'd witnessed a car accident. Her hands were shaking so badly she couldn't hold her coffee cup steady. She kept looking over her shoulder as if she expected someone to be following her. "Sarah," she whispered, and her voice cracked on my name. "I need to tell you something, but I don't know if you'll believe me. I don't know if I believe it myself." I set down my pen and gave her my full attention. In 15 years of nursing, I'd learned that when someone says they have something unbelievable to tell you, you better listen, because the unbelievable things are usually the most important ones. "What happened, Chloe?" I asked, keeping my voice gentle but firm. She looked like she might bolt at any second. She sat down across from me, glanced toward the door again, then leaned forward and spoke in a whisper so soft I had to strain to hear her. "I saw Dr. Thorne tonight, in Mr. Patterson's room, room 714. I knew Mr. Patterson, 73 years old, advanced Alzheimer's, part of Thorne's research study. His daughter visited every day and called him her fighter, because even in his confused state, he still had moments of clarity where he'd recognize her and smile. He was one of those patients who reminded you why you became a nurse in the first place." "What about him?" I asked, though something in Chloe's expression already had my stomach clenching. "Dr. Thorne wasn't supposed to see him tonight. There was no scheduled visit, no documented reason for him to be there, but I saw him going into the room around 10:45, and something felt off. You know how he usually is, confident, purposeful. But tonight he was different, secretive. He looked around to make sure no one was watching before he went in." Chloe paused, took a shaky breath, and continued. "I was curious. I know I shouldn't have been. But Dr. Thorne was my mentor, and I thought maybe he was doing some kind of advanced assessment I could learn from. So I watched through the door, just through the crack where it wasn't completely closed. My heart started beating faster. I had a feeling I knew where this was going, and I didn't like it." "What did you see, Chloe?" Her next words came out in a rush, like she had to get them out before she lost her nerve. "He had a syringe, not from our medication cart, not from any of the supplies we keep in the room. He pulled it from his own bag, a small black medical bag I'd never seen him carry before. And Sarah," she looked directly at me, and I saw fear in her eyes. Real, bone-deep fear. "The neurologist sedated a patient without consent." The words hung in the air between us like a toxic cloud. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. That awful sensation you get when you realize something you suspected but hoped wasn't true has just been confirmed. "Tell me exactly what you saw," I said, my voice steady despite the fact that my pulse was racing. Chloe took another shaky breath. "Mr. Patterson was agitated when Dr. Thorne entered the room. You know how he gets in the evenings, restless, trying to get out of bed, calling for his wife who died 3 years ago. Dr. Thorne didn't try to comfort him or use any of the standard de-escalation techniques. He just went straight to the bedside, pulled out this syringe that was already prepared, and injected it directly into Mr. Patterson's IV line. Jesus, I breathed. Within 2 minutes, Mr. Patterson went from agitated to completely calm. Not just calm, sedated. His eyes went glassy, his movements became sluggish, and then he just drifted off, like he'd been given a major tranquilizer. Doctor. Thorne waited a few more minutes, checked his pulse and breathing, then made some notes in a small notebook. Not in the official chart, Sarah. In his own personal notebook. Did he see you? No. I'm sure he didn't. I was careful. But Sarah, after he left, I went into Mr. Patterson's room to check on him. He was completely unconscious. I mean, completely. I've never seen him that deeply sedated, not even after surgery. His breathing was shallow but steady, his pupils were constricted, and he was completely unresponsive to voice or touch. Whatever Dr. Thorne gave him, it wasn't a mild sedative. I sat back in my chair, my mind racing. This wasn't just unethical. It was potentially criminal. Administering unlicensed medication to a patient without consent or documentation was assault. If the patient had an adverse reaction, it could be manslaughter. And if this was happening regularly with research subjects, it meant that every piece of data Thorne had collected was fraudulent. But I also knew that Chloe's word alone wouldn't be enough. Dr. Thorne was the golden boy, the untouchable star. If we made an accusation without ironclad proof, it would be buried so fast our heads would spin. Worse, Chloe would probably be fired for making false accusations against a respected physician, and I'd likely be reprimanded for supporting her. The hospital administration had too much invested in Thorne to let a couple of nurses bring him down with nothing but eyewitness testimony. Chloe, I said carefully, I believe you, but you know as well as I do that this won't be easy to prove. If we're going to do something about this, we need to be smart about it. She nodded, relief flooding her face at the fact that I believed her. What do we do? I looked at this young nurse who had just watched her professional hero reveal himself as a predator, and I made a decision that would change both our lives. We're going to catch him, but we're going to do it the right way, with evidence so solid that even the hospital board won't be able to ignore it. And this is where I need to pause for a moment to talk to you. Because if you're watching this channel, you know that hospital revenge is about more than just medical drama. It's about the everyday heroes who risk everything to fight against systems that protect the powerful and ignore the vulnerable. Chloe could have kept quiet, could have convinced herself she didn't see what she saw, could have protected her career by staying silent, but she didn't. She chose to speak up, knowing it might cost her everything. If you want to see more stories about people like Chloe, people who refuse to let injustice hide behind white coats and prestigious titles, make sure you subscribe to Hospital Revenge and hit that notification bell. Because the next story might be about someone you know, someone who chose courage over comfort. Now, back to our plan. Because what we were about to do would require military-level precision, and the kind of patience that only comes from knowing that justice isn't just worth waiting for, it's worth fighting for. The next morning, I called in a favor from Linda Chen, a nurse practitioner who'd worked in our wing for 12 years before transferring to the cardiac unit. Linda was someone I trusted implicitly, someone who understood that sometimes following orders isn't the same as doing what's right. I asked her to meet me for coffee before our shift started, and I laid out what Chloe had witnessed. Linda listened without interrupting, her expression growing more serious with each detail. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, staring into her coffee cup. "You know what you're suggesting, don't you?" she finally said. "If we do this and we're wrong, we're finished. All of us. And if we don't do it and we're right?" I countered. "How many more patients like Mr. Patterson get drugged without their consent? How many research studies get contaminated with falsified data? How many families trust their loved ones to a doctor who sees them as lab rats instead of human beings?" Linda nodded slowly. "What do you need from me? Access to the lab, off-the-books blood work, and your word that you'll never tell anyone where the samples came from if this goes sideways." "You have all three," she said without hesitation. Our plan was elegantly simple, which is usually the best kind. We would document everything. Every unofficial visit Thorne made to his research patients, every period of unusual sedation, every discrepancy between official records and observed behavior. But most importantly, we would collect blood samples from his research subjects immediately before and after his undocumented visits. If he was drugging them, it would show up in toxicology screens. The tricky part was collecting the samples without anyone knowing. We couldn't use official lab orders because that would create a paper trail that could be traced back to us. We needed to collect the blood during routine draws and have Linda run the tests privately. It would require perfect timing, careful documentation, and the kind of luck that usually doesn't exist in real life. Chloe was on board immediately, driven by a combination of guilt for having idolized Thorne and determination to protect the patients she'd sworn to care for. We established a simple system. Chloe would text me whenever she saw Thorne making an unscheduled visit to any of his research patients. I would arrive as quickly as possible to observe and document the timing. Then, within 2 hours of his departure, we would collect blood samples during routine morning draws or medication administration, labeling them with coded identifiers that only we understood. The first opportunity came 3 days later. Chloe texted me at 9:47 p.m. "He's here. Room 718. Mrs. Goldstein." I was at home, but I drove back to the hospital and slipped in through the staff entrance. Mrs. Goldstein was another of Thorne's research subjects, an 81-year-old former teacher with moderate Alzheimer's. Her grandson visited regularly and always commented on how much calmer she seemed lately, how much easier it was to spend time with her compared to the early days of her diagnosis. I positioned myself where I could observe room 718 without being seen. Thorne emerged at 10:23 p.m., looking around carefully before heading toward the elevator. The moment he was gone, I slipped into Mrs. Goldstein's room. She was deeply asleep, breathing slowly and evenly, completely unresponsive when I gently called her name. I checked her chart. No sleep medications were documented for that evening. The next morning, during routine medication administration, I collected a small blood sample when I administered her morning pills. Mrs. Goldstein was still unusually drowsy, struggling to wake up fully even with gentle encouragement. I labeled the sample MG1 and secured it in a small cooler I'd hidden in my locker. We followed this pattern for 2 weeks, collecting samples from 4 different patients: Mr. Patterson, Mrs. Goldstein, Mr. Chen, a 79-year-old retired engineer, and Mrs. Williams, a 68-year-old former librarian. Every time Thorne made an undocumented visit, the patient would be found in an unnaturally deep sleep within an hour, and they'd remain drowsy and compliant for the next 12 to 18 hours. Linda ran the toxicology screens personally, using her access to the cardiac unit's lab during off-peak hours. What she found made our worst suspicions look optimistic. Every single sample showed traces of midazolam, a powerful benzodiazepine typically used for sedation during medical procedures. But these weren't therapeutic doses given with proper monitoring. These were significant amounts administered secretly to patients who couldn't consent, and whose medical records showed no indication for such medication. The levels were high enough to cause profound sedation, but carefully calculated to avoid respiratory depression or other life-threatening complications. Thorne wasn't just violating ethical guidelines. He was committing assault. He was drugging vulnerable elderly patients to make them compliant for his research, falsifying the very data that his prestigious publications were based on. Every paper he'd published, every grant he'd received, every award he'd won was built on a foundation of systematic patient abuse. But we still needed more than blood tests. We needed documentation that would stand up to legal scrutiny, evidence that would be impossible for the hospital administration to dismiss or cover up. So we began the most dangerous phase of our operation, creating a comprehensive timeline that would prove Thorne's pattern of abuse. I started keeping a detailed log of every interaction I observed between Thorne and his research subjects. Official visits versus undocumented visits. Patient behavior before and after each encounter. Discrepancies between chart documentation and observed reality. Chloe did the same, and we compared notes daily to ensure accuracy. What emerged was a clear pattern. Thorne would conduct his official research sessions during normal business hours, with proper documentation and nursing oversight. But he would return during evening or night shifts, when skeleton crews were focused on emergency care and routine monitoring. He would administer his illegal sedatives, wait to ensure the patients were stable, then leave. The next day, during his official sessions, he would find perfectly compliant subjects who couldn't resist his cognitive assessments, couldn't refuse his blood draws, couldn't provide informed consent because they were chemically subdued. The more we documented, the more horrifying the scope became. This had been going on for at least 8 months, possibly longer. Dozens of elderly patients with dementia had been secretly drugged, their autonomy stolen, their trust violated. Their families visited them thinking they were seeing natural disease progression, when in reality, they were seeing the effects of systematic medication abuse. By the end of our 3rd week, we had collected blood samples from 6 patients, documented 14 undocumented visits, and created a timeline that showed a clear pattern of illegal activity. But I knew that even with all this evidence, we needed to be strategic about how we presented it. If we went through normal channels, reporting to our supervisor, filing a complaint with human resources, or even contacting the ethics board, there was a significant chance the information would be buried or dismissed. Dr. Thorne wasn't just any doctor. He was the face of the neurology department, the star of the research division, the golden goose that laid million-dollar grants. The hospital had too much invested in his reputation to let it be destroyed by a couple of nurses with blood samples and handwritten notes. They would find ways to discredit us, to question our motives, to suggest we were jealous or vindictive or simply mistaken. No. If we were going to do this, we needed to go big. We needed to present our evidence to people who couldn't afford to ignore it. People whose own reputations would be damaged if they were seen as protecting a criminal. We needed to go directly to the hospital board of directors. St. Augustine Medical Center's board of directors included some of the most prominent business people and medical professionals in the state. The chairman was a retired federal judge. The vice chairman was the former dean of the state medical school. These were people who understood legal liability, professional ethics, and public relations disasters. If we could present our evidence to them in a formal setting, they wouldn't be able to simply sweep it under the rug. But getting access to the board wasn't simple. You couldn't just call up and ask for a meeting. There were protocols, procedures, and layers of bureaucracy designed to protect board members from frivolous complaints. However, there was one avenue available to hospital employees: the formal grievance process outlined in our employee handbook. Any employee who witnessed behavior that violated professional standards or endangered patient safety could request an emergency hearing with the ethics committee and hospital administration. The key word was emergency. It had to involve immediate danger to patients or potential legal liability for the hospital. What we had documented definitely qualified. I spent an entire weekend crafting our formal complaint. It had to be perfect, detailed enough to be credible, but concise enough to hold their attention. I laid out the timeline of events, referenced specific patient cases without violating HIPAA privacy rules, and presented our evidence in the same systematic way I'd seen lawyers do in medical malpractice cases. The complaint was 15 pages long, single-spaced, with appendices containing our documentation logs and Linda's lab reports. I titled it, Formal Complaint Regarding Systematic Patient Abuse and Research Fraud, by Dr. Marcus Thorne, Chief of Neurology. Then I submitted it through official channels, requesting an emergency hearing with the full board of directors. The response came faster than I expected. Within 48 hours, I received a call from Margaret Fitzgerald, the hospital's chief legal counsel. Her voice was carefully neutral, but I could hear the underlying tension. Nurse Henderson, I've reviewed your complaint regarding Dr. Thorne. These are very serious allegations. The board has agreed to hear your presentation next Tuesday at 6 p.m. in the main conference room. You'll have 30 minutes to present your case. I strongly recommend you bring legal representation. I thanked her and hung up, my hands shaking slightly. This was it. We were actually going to get our chance to present the evidence to the people who could do something about it. But I also knew that this was the most dangerous moment of the entire operation. If our presentation wasn't convincing, if the board decided we were wrong or malicious, our careers in healthcare would effectively be over. Chloe was terrified. What if they don't believe us? What if they think we're lying? Then we'll have done everything we could, I told her. Sometimes that's all you can do. Fight as hard as you can for what's right, even if you're not sure you'll win. But I was determined that we would win. We'd spent weeks collecting evidence, and I was going to present it in a way that would be impossible to ignore or dismiss. This wasn't just about Dr. Thorne anymore. It was about every patient who couldn't advocate for themselves, every family who trusted us to protect their most vulnerable members, every nurse who'd ever suspected something was wrong but didn't have the courage to speak up. The weekend before our presentation, I rehearsed it dozens of times. I practiced presenting the timeline, explaining the lab results, and answering the kinds of challenging questions I expected from board members. Chloe and I went over every detail of what she'd witnessed, making sure her testimony would be clear and compelling. Linda reviewed her lab procedures to ensure she could defend the validity of her tests if challenged. And here's where I want to pause again to ask you something. Have you ever been in a situation where you knew something was wrong, but speaking up would put everything you'd worked for at risk? Maybe it was at your job, in your family, or in your community. Maybe you stayed quiet because it seemed safer, because you thought someone else would handle it, or because you convinced yourself it wasn't your responsibility. If you've ever faced that choice between safety and justice, you know how terrifying it can be. Drop a comment below and tell me, would you risk your career to expose an injustice that everyone else seems willing to ignore? Because that's exactly what we were about to do, and your answer might surprise you. Tuesday arrived with the kind of gray, drizzling weather that seems designed to match your mood when you're about to do something that will either vindicate you completely or destroy your life. I arrived at the hospital an hour early, carrying a briefcase with multiple copies of our evidence, a laptop with our presentation slides, and the kind of nervous energy that comes from knowing you're about to walk into the most important meeting of your professional life. The main conference room was on the executive floor, a place I'd only been once before during new employee orientation. It was all polished wood and leather chairs, with a massive table that could seat 20 people and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. This was where million-dollar decisions were made, where careers were launched or destroyed with a single vote. Chloe arrived 15 minutes later, looking pale but determined. She was wearing her best professional outfit and carrying a folder with her own notes and documentation. Linda came with us for moral support, though she wouldn't be presenting. Her involvement needed to remain confidential to protect her position in the cardiac unit. At exactly 6 p.m., the board members began filing in. I recognized most of them from hospital publications and local news coverage. Judge Patricia Hawkins, the board chairman, was a silver-haired woman in her 70s, with the kind of penetrating stare that probably terrified defendants in her courtroom. Dr. James Morrison, the former medical school dean, looked like Central Casting's idea of a distinguished physician. Robert Chen, no relation to Mr. Chen, one of our patients, a prominent businessman and hospital benefactor, carried himself with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no. But the person who made my stomach clench was Dr. Elizabeth Warren, the current chief of staff and Thorne's direct supervisor. She'd been instrumental in recruiting Thorne to St. Augustine, and his success had been a major boost to her own career. If anyone at that table had a vested interest in protecting Thorne, it was her. Margaret Fitzgerald, the legal counsel, took a seat at the side of the table with a legal pad and recording device. "This hearing is being recorded for legal purposes," she announced. "Nurse Henderson, you have 30 minutes to present your complaint. Please begin." I stood up, looked around the table at these powerful people who held my future in their hands, and began the presentation I'd rehearsed 100 times. "Thank you for agreeing to hear our concerns. My name is Sarah Henderson, and I've been a senior nurse in the neurology wing of this hospital for 15 years. I'm joined today by Nurse Chloe Martinez, who has worked in neurology for 2 years. We're here because we've discovered evidence of systematic patient abuse and research fraud being committed by Dr. Marcus Thorne." I could see the immediate reaction around the table: surprise, skepticism, and in Dr. Warren's case, what looked like barely controlled anger. But I continued, my voice steady and professional. "Before I present our evidence, I want to be clear about something. We didn't come forward lightly. Dr. Thorne is a respected colleague and a renowned researcher. Making these allegations puts our careers at risk. We're here because we believe patient safety and professional ethics are more important than personal consequences." I clicked to my first slide, showing a timeline of Thorne's research study and the patients involved. For the past 8 months, Dr. Thorne has been conducting a longitudinal study on Alzheimer's patients. This study has been properly approved and appears to follow all ethical guidelines. However, we have discovered that Dr. Thorne has been making undocumented visits to his research subjects and administering unauthorized sedatives without patient consent or medical justification. Dr. Morrison leaned forward. "Those are extremely serious allegations, Nurse Henderson. I hope you have substantial evidence to support them." "I do," I replied, clicking to the next slide. On October 15th, Nurse Martinez witnessed Dr. Thorne administering an injection to patient Harold Patterson from a syringe he brought from his personal medical bag. This injection was not documented in the patient's chart, was not ordered by any physician, and was not part of any approved treatment protocol. Nurse Martinez, would you please describe what you witnessed? Chloe stood up, her voice shaking slightly but growing stronger as she spoke. I saw Dr. Thorne inject something directly into Mr. Patterson's IV line at approximately 10:47 p.m. Mr. Patterson went from agitated to completely sedated within minutes. When I checked on him later, he was unconscious and unresponsive to voice or touch. His breathing was shallow, his pupils were constricted, and he remained in this state for over 12 hours. Judge Hawkins frowned. What medication do you believe was administered? I clicked to our next slide, showing Linda's lab results. We collected blood samples from Mr. Patterson and 5 other research subjects immediately after similar undocumented visits by Dr. Thorne. Toxicology analysis shows significant levels of midazolam in all samples, a powerful sedative that was not prescribed for any of these patients. The room went completely silent. Dr. Warren's face had gone white, while Robert Chen was studying the lab results with the kind of intense focus I'd seen him use during hospital budget meetings. I continued through our presentation, showing the timeline of undocumented visits, the pattern of patient sedation, and the systematic nature of what we'd discovered. With each slide, the atmosphere in the room grew more tense. These weren't accusations anymore. They were facts, supported by blood tests, documented observations, and a clear pattern of behavior. The implications of this evidence are severe, I said as I approached my conclusion. Dr. Thorne has been systematically drugging vulnerable patients without their consent, falsifying research data, and violating every principle of medical ethics. Every study result he's published based on this research is fraudulent. Every grant received based on this work was obtained through deception. And every patient involved has been the victim of assault. Judge Hawkins looked around the table at her fellow board members. Questions for the presenting nurses? Dr. Morrison was the first to speak. Nurse Henderson, why didn't you report this through normal channels? Why come directly to the board? Because Dr. Thorne isn't just any physician, I replied. He's the star of our neurology department, bringing in millions in research funding. We were concerned that a normal complaint might be buried or dismissed to protect the hospital's interests. These patients deserved better than that. Robert Chen leaned forward. How many patients do you believe have been affected? Based on our documentation, at least 8 patients over the past 8 months. But Dr. Thorne has been conducting similar research for over 2 years. The actual number could be much higher. Dr. Warren finally spoke, her voice tight with controlled emotion. These allegations are career-destroying. I hope you understand the gravity of what you're claiming. I understand completely, I replied, looking directly at her. That's exactly why we documented everything so carefully. We knew we'd only get one chance to present this evidence, and we knew it had to be irrefutable. Judge Hawkins called for a 5-minute recess while the board members consulted privately. Chloe and I stepped into the hallway, both of us shaking from the adrenaline of having just presented the most important case of our careers. Do you think they believe us? Chloe whispered. They have to, I replied. The evidence is too solid to ignore. When we returned to the conference room, Judge Hawkins' expression was grim. Nurse Henderson, Nurse Martinez, the board thanks you for bringing this matter to our attention. The allegations you've presented are extraordinarily serious and will require immediate investigation. Dr. Thorne will be suspended pending a full inquiry. The research study will be terminated immediately, and all patients involved will receive comprehensive medical evaluation. Relief flooded through me, but Judge Hawkins wasn't finished. However, I want to be clear about something. If this investigation reveals that your allegations are false or exaggerated, there will be serious consequences for your careers and potential legal action for defamation. Are you prepared to stand by everything you've presented here tonight? I looked at Chloe, who nodded firmly, then back at the board. Absolutely. Every piece of evidence we've presented is accurate and can be verified independently. Very well. This meeting is adjourned. You'll be contacted by our legal department regarding your continued cooperation with the investigation. As we left the conference room, I felt a mixture of exhaustion and vindication. We'd done it. We'd presented our case, and the board had taken it seriously enough to suspend Thorne and launch a full investigation. But I also knew this was just the beginning. The real test would come when investigators started digging deeper into Thorne's research practices. The next few days were surreal. Word of Thorne's suspension spread through the hospital like wildfire, though the official reason given was administrative leave pending internal review. Most staff assumed it was related to some kind of bureaucratic issue. Budget problems, research protocol violations, maybe a personality conflict with administration. The idea that the golden boy of neurology had been systematically drugging patients was too shocking for most people to even consider. But within a week, the investigation had expanded beyond anything we'd imagined. Hospital security reviewed access logs and discovered that Thorne had been entering patient rooms during off hours far more frequently than we'd documented. Pharmacy records showed discrepancies in controlled substance inventories that matched the timeline of his undocumented visits. Most damaging of all, investigators found Thorne's personal notebook, which contained detailed records of the medications he'd administered and the effects he'd observed. The notebook was like a confession written in Thorne's own hand. He'd been methodically documenting his illegal sedation of research subjects, noting dosages, timing, and patient responses. He'd even written observations about which patients required higher doses to achieve compliance, and which medications worked best for different types of dementia. It read like the journal of a serial predator who saw vulnerable elderly patients as nothing more than laboratory animals. 2 weeks after our presentation to the board, the full scope of Thorne's crimes became clear. The hospital's internal investigation had uncovered evidence of patient abuse dating back nearly 3 years. The pharmacy audit revealed that he'd been systematically stealing controlled substances, using his position and reputation to avoid scrutiny when drug inventories didn't match prescription records. Security footage, once investigators knew what to look for, showed him entering patient rooms at unusual hours with his personal medical bag, staying for brief periods, then leaving without any documentation. But the most damning evidence came from his own research data. When independent investigators analyzed his published studies, they found patterns that were statistically impossible without some form of patient manipulation. His Alzheimer's subjects showed levels of compliance and cooperation that didn't match any known clinical presentation of the disease. His cognitive assessment scores were too consistent, too predictable, too clean to be legitimate. He'd been publishing fraudulent research for years, built on a foundation of systematic patient abuse. The criminal charges came swiftly after that. Dr. Marcus Thorne was arrested on 43 counts of assault, multiple counts of theft of controlled substances, research fraud, and insurance fraud. The man who'd been considered one of the nation's leading neurologists was led away in handcuffs, his career and reputation destroyed in a matter of weeks. The civil lawsuits followed immediately. Families of affected patients filed a class action suit against both Thorne and the hospital, claiming negligence and demanding damages for the violation of their loved ones' rights. The pharmaceutical company that had funded his research launched their own investigation and demanded return of millions in grant money. Medical journals began retracting his published papers, and universities started removing his research from their curricula. But for me, the most satisfying moment came during Thorne's criminal trial, when I was called to testify about our investigation. The prosecutor walked me through our evidence step by step, and I watched the jury's faces as they realized the scope of what this supposedly respected doctor had done to vulnerable patients who couldn't protect themselves. Thorne's defense attorney tried to discredit our evidence, suggesting that we'd been motivated by jealousy or personal animosity. But when the prosecutor presented our meticulous documentation, the blood test results, and Thorne's own notebook confessing to his crimes, the defense crumbled. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Dr. Marcus Thorne was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. His medical license was permanently revoked. The hospital paid out over $40 million in civil settlements, and the families of his victims finally got the justice they deserved, even if they could never get back the trust and dignity that had been stolen from their loved ones. Chloe and I were recognized by the state nursing board for our courage in exposing the abuse. We both received commendations for professional excellence and patient advocacy. But more importantly, we'd proven that sometimes the system can work when people are willing to fight for what's right, even when it's dangerous. The aftermath wasn't all positive, though. Some staff members blamed us for destroying the reputation of the neurology department. A few colleagues stopped speaking to us, claiming we'd betrayed a respected physician over what they saw as minor protocol violations. Dr. Warren, Thorne's former supervisor, was forced to resign after the investigation revealed she'd ignored several red flags about his behavior. The entire research program had to be rebuilt from scratch, and it took years for the department to recover its credibility. But I'd do it all again without hesitation. Because at the end of the day, our job as healthcare professionals isn't to protect prestigious doctors or institutional reputations. Our job is to protect patients, especially the ones who can't protect themselves. Mr. Patterson, Mrs. Goldstein, Mr. Chen, Mrs. Williams, and all the other victims of Thorne's abuse deserved advocates who would fight for them, even when it meant risking everything. The case also led to significant changes in hospital policies nationwide. Many medical centers implemented new oversight procedures for research studies, requiring independent monitoring of all patient interactions. Pharmacy controls were strengthened to prevent unauthorized access to controlled substances. And most importantly, healthcare workers were given new protections for reporting suspected abuse, with direct access to ethics boards and external oversight agencies. Looking back now, 5 years later, I realized that our investigation was about more than just stopping one criminal doctor. It was about sending a message that no one, no matter how prestigious, how well-connected, or how profitable, is above the law when it comes to patient safety. It was about proving that a couple of nurses with clipboards and courage could take down a predator who thought his reputation made him untouchable. The patients we protected couldn't thank us. Most of them never fully understood what had been done to them, but their families did. I still get Christmas cards from Mr. Patterson's daughter, who writes about how grateful she is that someone stood up for her father when he couldn't stand up for himself. Mrs. Goldstein's grandson named his first daughter Sarah, telling me it was to honor the nurse who gave his grandmother back her dignity. These moments remind me why we did what we did, and why it was worth every risk we took. The case also taught me something important about institutional power, and how it can corrupt even well-intentioned systems. St. Augustine Medical Center wasn't an evil place. It was filled with good people trying to provide excellent patient care. But the pressure to maintain prestigious doctors and lucrative research programs had created an environment where warning signs were ignored and uncomfortable questions weren't asked. Thorne's reputation had become so valuable to the institution that it blinded people to the obvious evidence of his crimes. That's why whistleblowers are so important in healthcare. We're the ones who see the day-to-day realities that don't make it into official reports or board presentations. We're the ones who notice when something doesn't feel right, when patients are unusually compliant, when respected doctors make unscheduled visits with mysterious medical bags. And we're often the only ones willing to risk our careers to protect people who can't protect themselves. If you're a healthcare worker watching this, I want you to remember something. Your professional obligation is to your patients first, always. Not to your hospital, not to prestigious doctors, not to research programs or grant funding, to the vulnerable people who trust you with their lives and their dignity. If you see something that doesn't feel right, document it, investigate it, and if necessary, fight for it, even when everyone tells you to stay quiet and mind your own business. The Thorne case also highlighted the particular vulnerability of dementia patients in research settings. These are people who can't advocate for themselves, can't report abuse, can't even understand what's being done to them. They're completely dependent on healthcare workers to protect their interests. When we fail them, we fail our most fundamental duty as caregivers. Since our investigation, I've become involved in advocacy work for dementia patients and their families. I speak at conferences about recognizing signs of abuse in research settings. I've helped develop training programs for healthcare workers on protecting vulnerable populations. And I've worked with families to understand their rights and how to recognize when something isn't right with their loved one's care. One of the most important lessons from our case is that justice sometimes requires patience and strategic thinking. We could have reported Thorne after Chloe's first observation, but we knew that wouldn't be enough. We needed irrefutable evidence, documented patterns, and a presentation that would be impossible to dismiss. Sometimes protecting patients means playing the long game, building a case that can't be ignored or covered up. The blood samples were crucial, but they were just one piece of the puzzle. The timeline documentation, the pattern of behavior, the pharmacy discrepancies, and ultimately Thorne's own notebook. All of these elements together created a picture that was undeniable. No single piece of evidence would have been enough, but together they formed a compelling case that even Thorne's supporters couldn't defend. I also learned that institutional change is slow and often incomplete. 5 years later, there are still hospitals where prestige and profit take priority over patient protection. There are still researchers who see vulnerable patients as convenient test subjects, rather than human beings deserving of respect and dignity. Our case made things better, but it didn't solve the underlying problems that allowed Thorne to operate for years without detection. That's why stories like this matter. Every time we expose abuse, every time we hold powerful people accountable, every time we choose patient safety over institutional loyalty, we make it a little bit harder for the next predator to operate. We create precedents that protect future patients, even if we can't undo the harm that's already been done. The personal cost of our investigation was significant. Chloe left nursing entirely 2 years after the trial, saying she couldn't trust the medical system anymore, after seeing how easily it had been corrupted. She's now a social worker, still helping vulnerable people but in a different capacity. Linda continued working in the cardiac unit, but transferred to a different hospital, wanting a fresh start away from the memories of our investigation. I stayed at St. Augustine, partly because I felt a responsibility to help rebuild the neurology department's reputation, and partly because I wanted to make sure lessons learned from our case weren't forgotten. I've been promoted to nurse manager, and I use that position to advocate for strong patient protection policies and thorough oversight of research activities. But the emotional toll was real. For months after Thorne's arrest, I questioned every decision I'd made during our investigation. Had we moved too slowly? Should we have reported him sooner? Could we have prevented more patients from being abused? These questions haunted me, even though I knew logically that we'd done everything we could with the resources and authority we had. The trial was particularly difficult. Sitting in that courtroom, listening to testimony about what Thorne had done to helpless patients, seeing the pain in family members' faces as they learned the truth about their loved one's treatment. It was devastating, but it was also validating. We'd done the right thing, and justice was finally being served. One moment from the trial stands out in my memory. Thorne's attorney was cross-examining Chloe, trying to suggest that she'd misunderstood what she'd seen, that perhaps Dr. Thorne had been administering legitimate medication for a medical emergency. Chloe looked directly at Thorne and said, "I know what I saw. I saw a doctor who was supposed to protect vulnerable patients instead drug them without their consent so he could use them for his own purposes. I saw someone who violated every principle of medical ethics, and I'm proud that we stopped him." Thorne looked away, unable to meet her gaze. In that moment, I saw not the confident, charismatic physician who'd once commanded respect throughout the hospital, but a broken man who'd finally been held accountable for his crimes. The sentencing hearing was equally powerful. Several family members gave victim impact statements, describing how Thorne's abuse had affected their loved ones and their trust in the medical system. Mr. Patterson's daughter spoke about how her father had seemed unusually passive during his final months, how she'd attributed it to disease progression when it was actually the result of illegal sedation. Mrs. Goldstein's son talked about his mother's confusion and fear during her final days, wondering if she'd somehow known what was being done to her. When the judge handed down the 12-year sentence, there was a collective sigh of relief in the courtroom. Justice had been served, but more importantly, future patients would be protected from this particular predator. The civil settlements were substantial, but money could never truly compensate for the violation of trust and dignity that Thorne's victims had experienced. Some families used their settlements to establish scholarships for nursing students, wanting to support the next generation of patient advocates. Others donated to Alzheimer's research, hoping to advance legitimate scientific understanding of the disease their loved ones had suffered from. One of the most meaningful outcomes of our case was the policy changes it inspired. The Thorne Patient Protection Act, passed by our state legislature, requires independent oversight of all medical research involving vulnerable populations. It mandates that healthcare workers receive training on recognizing and reporting signs of abuse. It creates legal protections for whistleblowers who report suspected patient abuse. And it establishes severe penalties for healthcare providers who violate patient trust. The law has been adopted by 12 other states, and similar federal legislation is being considered. Every patient who benefits from these protections is a testament to the importance of speaking up when something isn't right, even when it's dangerous to do so. I've been asked many times if I regret getting involved, if I wish I'd just stayed quiet and focused on my own responsibilities. The answer is always no. Yes, it was terrifying. Yes, it risked everything I'd worked for. Yes, it changed my life in ways I never expected. But it also saved vulnerable patients from continued abuse. And it sent a message that no one is above accountability when it comes to patient safety. Healthcare is built on trust. Patients trust us with their lives, their dignity, their most vulnerable moments. When that trust is violated, it doesn't just harm individual patients. It undermines the entire foundation of medical care. By exposing Thorne's crimes, we helped restore that trust and reinforced the principles that should guide every healthcare interaction. The case also demonstrated the power of teamwork and persistence. Chloe's initial observation was crucial, but it wouldn't have been enough without Linda's laboratory expertise, without careful documentation, without strategic planning, and without the courage to present our findings to people who had the power to act. Justice rarely happens because of individual heroes. It happens because of teams of people working together toward a common goal. If I could go back and change anything about our investigation, I would have started documenting suspicious patterns earlier. I'd noticed that Thorne's patients seemed unusually compliant months before Chloe witnessed his criminal behavior. But I'd dismissed my concerns as unfounded suspicion. Trusting those instincts sooner might have prevented additional patients from being abused. But I also understand why I hesitated. Accusing a respected physician of criminal behavior is not something you do lightly. The professional and personal costs of being wrong would have been devastating. It's easy to say in retrospect that I should have acted sooner. But in the moment, with incomplete information and enormous pressure to maintain collegial relationships, the decision to wait for more evidence was understandable. This is one of the challenges facing healthcare workers who suspect abuse or misconduct. We're trained to be collegial, to respect hierarchy, to assume good intentions from our colleagues. These are generally positive traits that help healthcare teams function effectively. But they can also create barriers to reporting suspected abuse, especially when the suspected abuser is someone with prestige and power. That's why it's so important to have clear reporting mechanisms, legal protections for whistleblowers, and institutional cultures that prioritize patient safety over professional relationships. Healthcare workers need to know that they can report concerns without fear of retaliation, and that their concerns will be taken seriously, regardless of who is being accused. The Thorne case has become a teaching tool in nursing schools and medical ethics courses. Students learn about the importance of patient advocacy, the challenges of reporting suspected abuse, and the methods we use to gather evidence and present our case. I've been invited to speak at several universities, sharing our story with the next generation of healthcare providers. These speaking engagements are always emotional for me. I see young nurses and doctors who are idealistic and passionate about patient care, and I want to preserve that idealism while also preparing them for the realities they'll face. Healthcare is a noble profession, but it's also a human institution, subject to all the flaws and corruptions that affect any powerful system. My message to these students is always the same. Remember who you're really working for. Not the hospital, not the doctors, not the administration, the patients. When you're faced with a choice between protecting your career and protecting a patient, choose the patient every time. It might cost you professionally, but it will preserve your integrity and potentially save lives. I also emphasize the importance of documentation and evidence. Good intentions aren't enough if you can't prove your case. If you suspect abuse or misconduct, document everything. Keep detailed records. Gather evidence. Build a case that can't be dismissed or ignored. And remember that justice sometimes requires patience. Rushing to judgment without sufficient evidence can actually harm the patients you're trying to protect. The final lesson from our case is that change is possible, but it requires courage and persistence. Institutional power structures are designed to protect themselves, but they're not invincible. When dedicated people work together with clear evidence and strategic thinking, they can hold even the most powerful individuals accountable. Dr. Marcus Thorne thought his reputation made him untouchable. He believed that his prestige and the money he brought to the hospital would protect him from consequences. He was wrong. Justice doesn't care about your awards or your research grants or your professional standing. It only cares about right and wrong, and what he did to those vulnerable patients was unquestionably wrong. Today, The neurology wing at St. Augustine Medical Center has been completely rebuilt, with new leadership, new policies, and a new commitment to patient protection. The research program has been re-established with independent oversight and strict ethical guidelines. Most importantly, the culture has changed. Staff members know that patient safety comes first, always, and that concerns about potential abuse will be taken seriously regardless of who is being accused. But our work isn't finished. There are still hospitals where prestige trumps patient protection, where uncomfortable questions aren't asked, where vulnerable patients are seen as convenient research subjects, rather than human beings deserving of dignity and respect. There are still healthcare workers who see signs of abuse but don't report them, either because they're afraid of retaliation or because they can't believe their respected colleagues could be capable of such behavior. That's why I continue to tell this story, why I continue to advocate for patient protection policies, why I continue to train healthcare workers on recognizing and reporting signs of abuse. Because every patient deserves advocates who will fight for them, even when it's dangerous. Every vulnerable person deserves protection from those who would exploit their helplessness. And every healthcare system deserves the kind of vigilance that prevents predators from operating in the shadows. The silent syringe that Thorne used to drug his patients was a symbol of everything wrong with unchecked power in healthcare settings. It was silent because he operated without oversight, without accountability, without anyone questioning his actions. It was silent because his victims couldn't speak for themselves, couldn't report what was being done to them, couldn't fight back against someone who was supposed to be helping them. But it doesn't have to be silent anymore. Our investigation gave voice to those silent victims, exposed the predator who had been hiding behind a white coat and prestigious title, and sent a message that no one is above the law when it comes to patient safety. The syringe may have been silent, but justice was anything but quiet. And that brings us to the final question I want to leave you with. What would you do if you discovered that someone you respected, someone with power and prestige, was abusing vulnerable people who couldn't protect themselves? Would you speak up, even if it meant risking everything you'd worked for? Would you fight for justice, even if you weren't sure you could win? Because that's the choice we all face, not just in healthcare, but in every aspect of our lives. We can choose to protect the comfortable systems that benefit us, or we can choose to protect the vulnerable people who depend on us. We can choose silence and safety, or we can choose courage and justice. The choice seems obvious when you put it that way, but in the moment, when your career and your future are on the line, it's one of the hardest decisions you'll ever make. Chloe made that choice when she came to me with trembling hands and a story that could have destroyed her career. I made that choice when I decided to investigate instead of dismissing her concerns. Linda made that choice when she agreed to run unauthorized blood tests. We all made that choice when we walked into that conference room and presented our evidence to the hospital board, knowing that we might be ending our careers in healthcare. And we'd all make the same choice again, because some things are more important than job security. Some things are worth fighting for, even when the odds are against you. Some things are worth the risk, because the alternative, letting vulnerable people suffer in silence, is unacceptable. The silent syringe is no longer silent. The predator has been exposed and punished. The victims have received justice. The system has been changed to better protect future patients. And the message has been sent that patient advocates will not be silenced, will not be intimidated, and will not stop fighting for the people who cannot fight for themselves. That's the power of courage, the importance of evidence, and the victory of justice over prestige. That's what happens when healthcare workers remember who they really work for and what their profession really stands for. That's the story of how 3 nurses with clipboards and determination brought down a predator who thought he was untouchable. And that's why I'll never stop telling this story, never stop advocating for patient protection, and never stop believing that justice is possible when good people refuse to stay silent in the face of evil. If this story has inspired you to think about your own role in protecting vulnerable people, if it's made you consider what you would do in a similar situation, if it's reminded you that sometimes the most important battles are fought by ordinary people who refuse to accept that that's just how things are, then please share this video, subscribe to Hospital Revenge, and join our community of people who believe that justice is worth fighting for, even when it's dangerous. Because the next story we tell might be about you. The person who chose courage over comfort, who chose justice over job security, who chose to speak up when everyone else stayed silent. The person who proved that predators can be stopped, that systems can be changed, and that vulnerable people will always have advocates willing to fight for them. The silent syringe has been exposed. The predator has been punished. Justice has been served. But the fight for patient protection continues, and it needs people like you to keep fighting, keep watching, and keep refusing to let the vulnerable suffer in silence. Thank you for listening to our story. Thank you for caring about patient safety. And thank you for being the kind of person who would stand up for those who cannot stand up for themselves. Because that's what makes the difference between a healthcare system that protects predators and one that protects patients. The choice is yours. What will you do when you see something that isn't right? Will you stay silent, or will you speak up? Will you protect the system, or will you protect the vulnerable? Will you be part of the problem, or will you be part of the solution? The answer to that question will define not just your career, but your character. Choose wisely, because vulnerable people are counting on you to make the right choice, even when it's the hardest choice you'll ever make. This is Sarah Henderson, and this has been the story of the silent syringe that was silenced no more. Thank you for watching Hospital Revenge. And remember, justice is worth fighting for, even when the odds are against you.